Testing.
Good morning.
Good morning, Grace.
Hello, how are you, Salud?
Good, how are you?
Muy bien, gracias. You look sharp.
Trying to look formal. That we might get through.
I'm not offering 20 amendments myself, and there's nothing like that.
Let me see. My staff forget I'm blind as a bat, and they give me stuff that's 22 font. What's up with that?
Testing 1, 2, 3. Clerk desk.
Salute, are you saying 22 font is large or small? I'm not sure which direction you're going with that.
Believe it or not, it's small. I know my staff make fun of me. I'm an old man. See, you wouldn't know what 56 feels like. Don't worry, you'll get there. Huh, Grace? Well, everybody will get there.
I still only know what 40 feels like.
Oh,
Oh,
rub it in.
Brian. Well, all of you are youngsters compared to me. I'm 84.
But look at the wisdom.
Ahí se va.
Pardon the interruption, but I will remind members
Yes.
that while we are not broadcasting, you are live on internal house cable and Audible.
Oh, all right.
Thanks for the warning.
Just be careful. That must be good. What are you chomping on, Brian?
Well, Brian, thank you for sending us some of that, all right?
Thank you. I'm at the breakfast table. All of my kids get to hear you all.
Very, very cool.
My kids have never had the slightest interest in any congressional hearing. So yours are a step above mine, Brian.
Mine too.
I didn't say they were interested. I'm at the breakfast table. They're kind of roped into it.
All right. In California at 7 a.m. I almost felt like I was back in the military again. Getting up so darn early.
What branch, Salute?
The only branch, the United States Marine Corps.
Day's half over at 7 a.m. Army, we're up and at 'em, 4:35 a.m. It's good to know what time you guys get started.
Is the Army a United States military branch? Or is that kind of like the Boy Scouts? That was a joke, by the way. Nobody even
Well, I was scared to laugh. Salute.
You guys ready?
Wouldn't miss the elbows for the world. Salute. Happy to throw them back.
Salute. What about this, man, right here? Army strong, man. Army strong.
All right. I love
I
you.
think the chairman was Air Force, right? So we could probably
Committee
all
on
gang up
Transportation
on him.
Infrastructure will come to order. I call the Committee on Transportation and Infrastructure pursuant to Committee Rule 6F, House Rule 11-2H4. The chair may postpone further proceedings, say on any question, approving any measure, or adopting an amendment on which a recorded vote or yeas and nays are ordered, and without objection, the chair is authorized to declare recess at any time, without objection. Today, the committee will consider the approval of an updated committee roster due to changes on the majority side, an amendment in the nature of substitute to H.R. 1915, the Water Quality Protection Job Creation Act of 2001, and an amendment in the nature of a substitute to H.R. 3684, the Invest in America Act. As a reminder, it is the responsibility of each member seeking recognition to unmute their microphone prior to speaking and keep their microphone muted when not speaking to avoid inadvertent background noise. Should I hear any inadvertent background noise, I will request that the member please mute their microphone. There's something that's circulated on the Jimmy Kimmel show of me gaveling down someone during one of our last hearings. So to insert a document into the record, please have your staff email it to documentstni@mail.house.gov. And finally, all bill amendment text has been distributed electronically in accordance with the rules. And the first order of business today is the approval of the revised subcommittee rosters. The revised subcommittee rosters simply reflect the assignment of Rep. Troy Carter to the Subcommittee on Railroads, Pipelines, Hazardous Materials, and the Subcommittee on Economic Development, Public Buildings, and Emergency Management. I'm pleased to receive and have on the committee Representative Troy Carter. He is serving his first term as representative of Louisiana's 2nd District. I don't know if he's a good pitcher or not. He's replacing our winning ball pitcher, so I hope you're a pitcher. Otherwise, we might not win this year. He is a dedicated public servant who was the first African-American to represent his city council, state house, and state senate districts. He comes to committee after a career spent advocating for large-scale infrastructure projects on the state and local level. I know he's going to be a great addition to the committee, and I look forward to working with him. I now call up the subcommittee rosters, and without objection, the rosters are agreed to. Hearing none, the rosters agreed to. At this point, Carolyn Bordeaux, the vice chair of the Water Subcommittee, will assume the chair for the markup.
Our next item for consideration is H.R. 1915, the Water Quality Protection and Job Creation Act of 2021. Without objection, the Subcommittee on Water Resources and Environment is discharged from further consideration of H.R. 1915, and I call up the bill for consideration. Without objection, the first reading of the bill is dispensed with, and the bill is considered as read and open for amendment at any point. I have an amendment in the nature of a substitute. The clerk will designate the amendment.
Amendment in the nature of a substitute to H.R. 1915, offered by Ms. Bordeaux.
Without objection, the amendment in the nature of a substitute shall be considered as read and shall be considered base text for purposes of further amendment. I now recognize myself for a statement. Thank you, Chair DeFazio, Chair Napolitano, and Representative Fitzpatrick for your bipartisan work on H.R. 1915, the Water Quality Protection and Job Creation Act of 2021. In 2021, the American Society of Civil Engineers graded our wastewater infrastructure, the systems that purify our dirty water and keep pollutants separate from the water we drink every day, a D+. As a college professor, I can assure you that a D+ is not the grade we should strive for as a country in any department, let alone in how we purify our water. We all know that water and wastewater infrastructure are foundational pieces of infrastructure that allow our communities to grow and develop while protecting our environment and our health. The Water Quality Protection and Job Creation Act authorizes billions of dollars in direct investment over the next 5 years to ensure that our communities have what they need to grow and fix problems with existing water infrastructure. H.R. 1915 includes $40 billion over 5 years in wastewater infrastructure investments through the Clean Water State Revolving Fund, which provides low-interest loans, loan subsidies, and grants to communities for wastewater infrastructure. The bill also requires states to distribute a minimum of 20% of their SRF funds to municipalities as grants to increase the affordability of wastewater infrastructure to local communities, especially those that struggle to repay traditional federal loans. It also establishes a new clean water grant program to invest in communities with failing septic systems and prioritizes funding to those communities that today lack access to adequate sewage treatment systems. While many think of this as a rural issue, even in suburban areas such as my own, vast neighborhoods, often low income, have been skipped for development or redevelopment because of their dependence on septic tanks and lack of wastewater, sewer, and water infrastructure that will allow significant housing and commercial development. H.R. 1915 also includes my bill, the Wastewater Infrastructure Modernization Act, which creates a grant program to allow public utilities to purchase innovative clean water technology, such as sensors to detect and monitor the growth of harmful algae blooms and smart technology systems that monitor and control wastewater overflow and flooding. Such technology will modernize our water networks, lower upfront cost and ongoing operating costs for utilities, and improve the delivery of safe, reliable, clean water to our constituents, as well as prevent the environmental degradation of our waterways that endangers wildlife and the health of our communities. I appreciate that the committee has incorporated this important legislation into the underlying bill. All Americans deserve access to clean water, and the infrastructure support provided through this bill will be critical to the future economic development, health, and quality of life of so many in this country. I urge my colleagues to support H.R. 1915. I now recognize the ranking member of the full committee, Mr. Graves, for a statement.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I appreciate it. Throughout the nation, water infrastructure, wastewater infrastructure these projects are long past their design life and in need of urgent repair, in need of replacement and upgrading. And this committee has long proven it can successfully pass critical legislation and reauthorize programs through partnership and not partisanship. However, the majority has now decided to go its own way on clean water infrastructure in contrast to the last Congress. In the last Congress, we came to an agreement on a way to move forward on clean water infrastructure. And that bill, which is once celebrated by the majority as a means of making the federal government a significant partner in sewage treatment improvements, in authorizing robust but realistic levels of funding, contained common sense regulatory relief, and it looked out for the small and rural communities. And that bill passed with overwhelming support. In fact, every single member of this committee who served last Congress voted for that agreement. In today's bill, I predict we're not going to see the same outcome. Just a few weeks ago, we saw our Senate colleagues embrace a bipartisan approach. They passed a water infrastructure bill with realistic funding levels closely in line with our bipartisan agreement from last Congress. In fact, it looked very, very familiar. Committee Republicans have been ready to work on a bipartisan agreement that uses the bill that we had last year as the framework. There's common ground to be found, both providing robust but practical funding levels and finding ways to relieve some of the burdens that so many of our communities face. But instead, the majority decided to walk away from our previous agreement, authorize unrealistically high levels that will never get funded. Partisanship is why this program has not been reauthorized since it last expired in 1994. We have an opportunity here to show the American people that we can work together, and my Republican colleagues and I are ready to work on a serious effort to develop a bipartisan bill, but unfortunately the majority isn't interested in bipartisanship. So with that, I would urge my colleagues to vote against this bill, and with that, yield back.
I now recognize Chairman DeFazio for 5 minutes.
First, Madam Chair, that I will remind members that since some members are either reluctant to get vaccinated or to admit they have been vaccinated, that the physician has ruled that on the floor and in committee, except when speaking, you must wear your mask. So I would please ask people to comply with that rule, or maybe some folks on your side of the aisle can get vaccinated or admit they've been vaccinated. So thank you, Madam Chair. I strongly support this amendment in the nature of substitute, which authorizes over $50 billion to address America's wastewater infrastructure. You know, I often feel like I'm a broken record when I'm talking about this, about, you know, infrastructure that's failing, outdated, critical need of investment. Sewage and wastewater is no different than many other parts of our infrastructure. We get a D+ as a nation. It's estimated over the next 20 years that there will be a need for $300 billion of investment, and that doesn't account for sea level rise, severe weather events, other things that are a result of climate change. So the bill is actually going to be much higher. Now, there are, you know, some who say, well, it's up for the local communities. Well, you know, I recently held a statewide call with county commissioners. I'm a former county commissioner, used to dealing with these issues on the ground. A large majority of them are Republican. Most counties in Oregon are Republican, outside of a few highly populated blue areas. And they were all, to a one, desperate for federal help with their wastewater issues and their drinking water issues. I mean, the need is phenomenal. They also, many of them represent low-income rural areas. And they said, you know, we can't even work through the SRF program. So we've created two things here. We are going to reauthorize the SRF at a very robust level, $40 billion, and we're going to create a new $10 billion grant program for low-income communities and underserved and unserved communities across the country, so that they too can have access to good wastewater treatment, healthy rivers and streams, protect America's recreational resources, protect our agricultural resources, protect our clean water heritage in this country. You know, this is, you know, I hear the other side that this is too much. When did America become so puny? I just don't get it. $40 billion, too much. The need is over $300 billion. Someone's gonna have to spend it. It's gonna get done, or not. You know, when I was a young man in Oregon, in the University of Oregon, the Willamette River was an open sewer until we got federal help. When I was a county commissioner, we built a Metropolitan Wastewater Management Commission to end our part of the pollution of the Willamette River. And we got a 75% federal match. Today, that match averages 5%. 95% out of your constituents, out of their budgets, they're already stretched thin by other things if they don't get some federal help. Dirty water does not observe a city limit, a county boundary, a state boundary, or even an international boundary. This is a problem where the federal government has a legitimate interest and need to invest, and invest at a level that is not even what they really need, but at least will be helpful to these communities. If we put up 40 plus 10 for grants, you know, we're helping with a sixth of the need, So, you know, you know, I would like to do this in a bipartisan way, but, you know, the numbers are not adequate. And we're reflecting the numbers that President Biden has requested after a national assessment, a clear-eyed national assessment of the needs in wastewater and drinking water. He has a program of a total of $110 billion proposed, and I intend to deliver on our part of that. And then the second thing is we have, you know, woven through this, and we'll hear about this during the surface bill, woven through everything this committee does, is we're going to deal within our jurisdiction with the existential threat of climate change. And in the case of climate change as relates to wastewater, methane is, God, I see estimates 26 to 90 times worse than CO2. They describe it as CO2 on steroids. Sewer plants vent methane. We had testimony a year ago, last February, from a sewer district in New Jersey. They had to rebuild their system. They rebuilt it in a way where they captured their methane. They were able to generate all the electricity they needed to operate their plant, their highest single operating cost. They were able to sell electricity onto the grid. Electricity is really expensive in New Jersey. And they were able to keep their rates down, and they were keeping methane out of the atmosphere, a win-win-win situation. So we're going to condition that when you take this federal money and you build a new system, you've got to do the same thing. So it's time that we have a 21st century solution to 21st century problems. And wastewater is a huge problem. With that, I yield back the balance of my time.
I now recognize Mr. Rouser for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Madam Chair. You know, when I go home and I listen to my constituents, I often hear, why can't Congress be a little bit more bipartisan? And I always point out that as a member on the House Agriculture Committee and the Transportation and Infrastructure Committee, these historically have been two of the most bipartisan committees in Congress. Now, there's certainly complicated reasons why there's not more bipartisanship, but our constituents' message is pretty clear. They want us to work together to solve America's problems. And I'm sure that all of us here participating in this markup today hear that very same message. And of course, one of the problems they want to see fixed is our country's wastewater infrastructure. As the chairman said, the American Society of Civil Engineers has given our wastewater infrastructure a grade of D+. Our cities, towns, and states are contending with aging wastewater infrastructure, all the while grappling with all the requirements of the Clean Water Act. Many of the programs in this bill haven't been authorized in years. In fact, the Clean Water State Revolving Loan Fund hasn't been authorized in almost 30 years. However, it is still one of the best avenues for states and localities to address critical water infrastructure needs. Communities throughout the country face a number of challenges to addressing their clean water infrastructure issues. These include dwindling local budgets, access to independent financing, and mounting regulatory burdens. And unfortunately, I'm afraid that today's bill is a missed opportunity on that front. In the last Congress, we came to an agreement on a way to move forward on clean water infrastructure. That bill authorized a realistic level of funding, provided necessary regulatory relief, and took care of our small and rural communities. We moved that legislation with overwhelming bipartisan support. Overwhelming. We have also seen our colleagues in the Senate embrace a bipartisan approach, passing a water infrastructure bill a few weeks ago by a vote of 89 to 2. That bill contained funding levels similar to those this committee agreed to last Congress, as opposed to the enormous, unrealistic amounts being pushed by the majority here today. And looking at the Senate's actions this year and the agreement we reached last Congress, there is obviously plenty of precedent for bipartisanship on clean water infrastructure. We have a rare opportunity here to show the American people that we can work together. But unfortunately, by abandoning our bipartisan agreement and choosing partisanship, I fear the majority has squandered this opportunity. As we all know, a bird in hand is always better than 2 or 3 in the bush. And I might add that the President issued a statement in support of the Senate's efforts on their very bipartisan bill. For these reasons, I urge my colleagues to oppose this legislation, and I yield back the balance of my time.
I now recognize Ms. Napolitano for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I associate myself with Chairman DeFazio's comments and remarks, but I do rise in strong support of 1915, a bipartisan bill, which I introduced with Chairman DeFazio and Congressman Fitzpatrick Over the last 4 years, my subcommittee has held several hearings on the need to invest in nation's wastewater infrastructure and has heard strong support from our witness for this legislation. The American Society of Civil Engineers gave America's wastewater infrastructure a grade of D+. Imagine D+ in its 2021 report card. The robust funding levels and this bipartisan proposal are critical to improving this grade and addressing EPA's estimated $270 billion backlog over the next 20 years in wastewater and stormwater upgrades. Similarly, in his American Jobs Plan, President Biden further stressed the importance of water and wastewater investment, not only for the number of jobs that will create, but also for how investments in safe, efficient, and sustainable water infrastructure are critical to the health and well-being of every American. Furthermore, the Clean Water Act has not been authorized since 1987, as was stated before. This is over 30 years since we have revisited and updated this foundational law. That's why it is crucial that we enact this proposal before the committee today. It provides the necessary clarity and commitment to addressing the nation's clean water needs. Excuse me. The Water Quality Protection and Job Creation Act is supported by over 60 bipartisan co-sponsors and by over 70 organizations, including state clean water authorities, local sanitation districts, environmental NGOs, labor unions, the U.S. Chamber of Commerce, mayors and county commissioners, construction and manufacturing groups, conservation and water reuse associations. The diverse coalition supporting this bill came together because they recognize that America needs efficient, innovative, and resilient wastewater infrastructure. This bill will deliver exactly that. It not only authorizes over $50 billion to modernize our infrastructure, but also ensures that the new investments will prioritize sustainable and resilient approaches that increase the overall protection of human health and the health of our environment and resiliency of our communities. This bill includes many provisions I've worked on and very strongly support. In particular, I have to see the provision that expands support and eligibility for recapturing and reusing wastewater and stormwater for both non-potable and drinking water needs, something that is very important to all of our constituents and community across the West and the rest of the nation that are currently experiencing more frequent and historically severe droughts. I also want to highlight provision in this bill to increase the affordability of wastewater infrastructure funding to economically disadvantaged communities. These communities, which are often communities of color, struggle to afford the necessary infrastructure upgrades necessary to protect water quality and human health, and the increased funding and grant assistance authorized by HR 1950 will greatly assist in addressing these local needs. I am also proud of the increased infrastructure investment on tribal lands. Thank you, tribal lands contained in this legislation. As we heard at subcommittee hearing in February, the backlog of tribal sanitation needs is approximately $2.7 billion. And 1915 seeks to partner with tribal communities to address these critical needs. Madam Chair, all our communities are struggling to address the challenges of our aging water infrastructure. Further delay only pushes the burden down the road to future generations. But now is the time to invest in this critical infrastructure. No more Band-Aids, no more kicking the can down the road, please. I strongly support the bill and urge all members to vote yes on this adoption. I yield back.
I now recognize Mrs. Steele for 5 minutes.
Thank you very much, Chairman DeFazio and Ranking Member Graves, for allowing me to speak on the Water Quality Protection and Job Creation Act. Although I do have some concerns with this legislation, there are serious concerns with aging wastewater infrastructure.
Can you pause for just a minute? We need to turn up the volume. Just 1 sec. Okay, can you turn up your volume?
Is this good? Is this good?
Okay.
Is this okay?
Okay, try again. We'll see if this works.
Too low.
Chairman DeFazio and Ranking Member Graves for allowing me to speak on the Water Quality Protection and Job Creation Act. Although I do have some concerns with this legislation, there are serious concerns with aging wastewater infrastructure. In my district, the city of Laguna Beach and local water districts have been working to prevent dangerous sewage leaks. The city and the Emerald Bay Service District are entirely dependent on the North Coast Interceptor wastewater transmission pipeline to transport wastewater. In late November 2019, 1.7 million gallons of raw sewage leaked from city-owned sewer transmission pipeline, prompting the Orange County Healthcare Agency to close 16 miles of ocean bay areas from Newport Beach to San Clemente. A valve assembly on the main pipeline failed about a quarter mile from the coastal treatment plant in Aliso Canyon. The city of Laguna Beach is working to eliminate sewage spills permanently, has completed a reliability assessment of this 30-year-old pipeline to prepare for improvements. The city is now seeking funding to complete a condition assessment to prioritize the next phases of the replacement project. Another key project is the replacement of South Orange County Wastewater District Sewage Lift Station 2, which has been at risk for major sewer spills in the past, resulting in environmental impacts and beach closures. In late 2019, roughly 1.4 million gallons of sewage spilled from the city of Laguna Beach system to Aliso Creek and the Pacific Ocean. The district is working to secure funding to move their largest sewage lift station. Their goal is to move the station out of the 100-year flood plan and the mapped tsunami flood zone to a safe location. The project would also minimize the risk of sewage entering the ocean from the future spill in this area. Federal funding is critical for these and other wastewater projects, and I'm encouraged that the federal government can work with local government to help address these major environmental issues and modernize their wastewater infrastructure. Thank you, and I yield back.
Thank you. I now recognize Mrs. Johnson from Texas.
Thank you very much, Madam Chair. Let me express my appreciation for us getting to this point and to say that I will put my full statement in the record. Thank you very much, and I yield back.
Thank you. I now recognize Mrs. Wilson from Florida.
Thank you, Chairman DeFazio and Ranking Member Graves, for the work you and the committee have done on this critical water and wastewater infrastructure bill. I fully support the legislation and its provisions to invest in resiliency projects to combat climate change, create jobs, and provide funding to support our local communities. Thank you for including my amendment to provide a set aside of funding for treatment facilities in economically disadvantaged municipalities to carry out projects to address their efforts. I'm pleased that the Water Quality Protection and Job Creation Act takes bold steps to invest in sewage overflow and storm water reuse municipal projects. For far too long, communities in South Florida have struggled with the impact of constant flooding due to increased sea level rise. As South Florida faces a $4 billion price tag to replace septic systems, I am proud of the inclusion of grant funding to help low-income households install, repair, and replace their septic tanks. While this grant funding is a critical step forward, We must continue to find solutions to address this issue, especially in large urban areas and in our rural communities. As the representative of a district on the front line of climate change, I have both fought endlessly, and I'm grateful for additional funding for projects that address green infrastructure to mitigate flooding and other climate events. Thank you again, Chairman DeFazio, for your amazing leadership on this comprehensive legislation. With that, I yield back.
I now recognize Mr. Carbajal.
Thank you. Thank you, Chairwoman Napolitano, Bordeaux, and Chairman DeFazio for your determination and hard work in advancing this bipartisan legislation to reauthorize the Clean Water State Revolving Fund, SRF. This is a good bill to help increase our investments in our nation's water infrastructure. It goes a long way in helping bring our water infrastructure to a state of good repair, supporting good paying jobs and increasing resiliency. I am proud to have worked with Chairwoman Napolitano and Chairman DeFazio to ensure resiliency is part of this legislation to fund our nation's infrastructure, and that my bill, the Clean Water Infrastructure Resiliency and Sustainability Act, was included in this legislation. As we continue to see the prevalence of extreme weather events become more and more common, including longer and more severe drought conditions, this is a step in the right direction. It would ensure we are supporting smart investments to build or rebuild threatened water infrastructure, increase efficiency in the use of water, and implement advanced treatment technologies such as water reuse and recycling. Thank you. I yield back.
I now recognize Mr. Delgado for 5 minutes. Mr. Delgado, are you on? No. Okay, we'll circle back. I now recognize Mr. Kahele for 5 minutes.
Aloha, Madam Chair, Chair DeFazio, Chair Napolitano, Mr. Ranking Member, my colleagues on this committee. Thank you for offering me the opportunity to speak in support of the Water Quality Protection and Job Creation Act of 2021. This bipartisan legislation renews our federal commitment to improving local water infrastructure by providing federal funding to construct and repair our nation's failing wastewater systems. This bill will invest over $50 billion in clean water infrastructure, with $40 billion for the Clean Water State Revolving Fund, $2 billion for projects which capture and reuse sewer overflows, and $2.5 billion for state water pollution programs. This is a good bill for the country. In addition, the Clean Water SRF will establish a new clean water grant to invest in communities with failing septic systems. Importantly, this grant will prioritize funding to those communities that still lack access to adequate sewage treatment systems. This grant program will make a significant difference in my home state of Hawaii, specifically on my home island of Hawaii Island. And to date, there are nearly 90,000 cesspools across the state of Hawaii that discharge 53 million gallons of untreated sewage into the ground every single day. Just think about that. Cesspools and the lack of wastewater infrastructure threaten our community's health, our land, and our oceans. We must act now to modernize our aging wastewater infrastructure by scaling up and implementing successful programs that address wastewater, particularly in rural areas throughout our country. I'm grateful for the committee's acknowledgement that we must prioritize communities that still lack access to adequate sewage treatment systems. Federal funds like these will make a significant difference in communities throughout Hawaii and our country. So I look forward to voting in favor of the bill, and I urge my colleagues to vote in favor as well. Mahalo, Madam Chair, and I yield back.
I now recognize Mr. Malinowski for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I just want to briefly comment in response to the comments we've heard about the need for bipartisanship here, which is something that I strive for and agree with. Like many of us, I would say probably all of us on this committee, I represent communities in my district, multiple communities with dangerously aging water infrastructure, water systems. I represent multiple rural communities that aren't even connected to water systems, whether new or aging. And most of the communities I represent are led by Republicans, not by Democrats. And there's unanimity among them that we need an approach such as this. But this isn't only bipartisan back home. It's actually bipartisan here in the House of Representatives. This morning, the Bipartisan Problem Solvers Caucus is releasing its blueprint for an infrastructure bill. That's 29 Republicans, 29 Democrats. And we are proposing $60 billion for water and sewer systems over 8 years, which is a number almost identical to what we are doing today in this committee, and significantly more than, for whatever reason, Republicans on this committee were willing to accept. So many of us would like to do even more. We think the need is even greater. Some of us would like to do significantly less, but the bipartisan common ground is essentially where we have landed on this committee. And so for anybody who is answering those questions back home about why can't you be more bipartisan, why can't you find common ground? Well, the answer is basically what we're doing today, because it reflects a consensus in basically the only bipartisan room in the House of Representatives where we've actually hammered together something that is not lowest common denominator, but a true compromise between the two sides. Thank you, and I yield back.
Thank you. I now recognize Mr. Delgado for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Chairman, and thank you for your work and to craft a critically important investments in America, clean water infrastructure. It's overdue, and it's good to be in a position where we're going to be able to get this done. I'm proud that my bill, the bipartisan Clean Water for Rural America Act, is included in today's markup. The bill increases technical assistance grant funding for the Clean Water State Revolving Fund, providing critical support for rural communities to access low-interest loans authorized by the Clean Water Act. Technical assistance grants allow small and rural municipalities, which often lack the resources necessary to apply for these funds, to shoulder the burden of submitting applications. As this committee increases overall funding for the Clean Water State Revolving Fund, my legislation ensures that technical assistance grant funding grows at the same pace. The Clean Water for Rural America Act levels the playing field for rural communities and helps ensure that all of our towns and cities, regardless of size, can access this critically important federal program. Thank you again. I yield back.
Do any other members wish to be recognized to speak on the amendment? We will now move to consideration of amendments to the amendment in the nature of a substitute. Before doing so, I would like to note that while the amendment in the nature of a substitute to H.R. 1915 is considered as read and open for amendment at any point, for the convenience of members and staff on both sides of the aisle, we will be considering amendments in the order listed on the roster provided to your office electronically. With that in mind, I have a manager's amendment at the desk. The clerk will designate the amendment.
Amendment to the amendment in the nature of a substitute to H.R. 1915, offered by Ms. Bardot, number manager 01.
Without objection, the amendment will be considered as read. I now recognize myself for a statement on the amendment. I rise in support of my manager's amendment to the amendment in nature of a substitute. This amendment includes proposals submitted by members of both parties and demonstrates a good faith effort to be receptive to important issues to members of this committee. Specifically, this amendment includes language offered by Mrs. Wilson to ensure that economically disadvantaged communities are able to access construction funding for resilient wastewater infrastructure projects and receive technical assistance from an EPA municipal ombudsman to ensure compliance with the Clean Water Act. Another provision incorporates a proposal for Mr. Garamendi and Mr. Brown to incorporate corrosion prevention activities for eligible projects under the Clean Water State Revolving Fund. Utilizing corrosion prevention activities will help prevent degradation of wastewater infrastructure and is a cost-effective option for extending the life cycle of critical water infrastructure. It also includes a separate amendment offered by Mr. Garamendi that aligns the cost share of projects carried out under the Alternative Water Source Program, which is reauthorized by the underlying bill. Additionally, the manager's amendment includes a proposal from Mr. Mast to ensure that the Environmental Protection Agency's Needs Assessment Survey includes construction cost estimates for both planned and needed publicly owned treatment works to address resilience and sustainability needs. This provision also allows states to reserve some federal funding to carry out their needs assessment survey, helping ensure an accurate and timely report. I remain a little concerned that this proposal could divert some vital construction funds to what should be a state administrative responsibility, but agree on the need for a robust clean water needs survey. Finally, this amendment incorporates language from Mrs. Gonzalez-Colon that provides further clarity that federal SRF capitalization grant funds are used for their intended purpose and invested in projects that will improve water quality. Again, I strongly support this bipartisan manager's amendment and urge its adoption. Do any other members wish to be recognized to speak? Oh. All right. I now recognize Mr. Graves for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Unfortunately, I cannot support the manager's amendment to this bill. There's some worthy ideas that are in this amendment that do showcase, though, the missed opportunity for bipartisanship and committee minority participation, which is emblematic of the legislation overall. There are other ideas in here that were rushed, and we have not had the proper time to work out those improvements. So I do oppose this amendment, and I yield back the balance of my time.
I now recognize Mr. Rouser for 5 minutes.
Madam Chair, I think the ranking member said it very, very well. I believe it's a missed opportunity and unfortunately urge opposition to the manager's amendment as well.
I now recognize Mr. Bost for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I just wanted to comment, if I could, on the part of this amendment, which is Mr. Garamondi's amendment, that adds corrosive prevention activity, eligible projects under the Clean Water Revolution Fund. This amendment builds upon something that I did last Congress to protect and maintain bridge infrastructure through critical industrial painting practices. And it is no secret that infrastructure is naturally prone to corrosion. Corrosion has and will be a barrier to the successful development of long-term operation of American businesses and commercial infrastructure, and if it's not maintained correctly. You know, this includes waterways and bridges for using transporting goods. The amendment helps to ensure that our infrastructure is maintained in a productive manner. And had this been in a more bipartisan manner, I would have continued to support, but I do support and agree with our ranking member that had we been able to work together, and my hope is that we do come back with something, because I don't see this go anywhere in the Senate, that we can work together to make sure that that is in there. It is something that I would support, and with that, I yield back.
The chair recognizes Mrs. Gonzalez-Colon for 5 minutes. Mrs. Gonzalez Colon, is she on? Okay. I now recognize Mr. Katko for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Madam Chair. And I would like to comment on the Water Quality Protection and Job Creation Act of 2021. I would also like to thank the Chairman DeFazio, Chairwoman Napolitano, and my friend from Pennsylvania, Congressman Fitzpatrick, for their work on the legislation. Our nation needs strong federal investment in our clean drinking water systems, and that is especially clear in the district I represent in Central New York. Struggles with our aging sewage and stormwater systems have contributed to severe water quality issues, including the presence of harmful algal blooms that have threatened the safety and accessibility of critical local water resources. Our communities simply cannot address these challenges alone, and I am pleased that this legislation would authorize over $50 billion to assist state and local authorities in modernizing our clean water infrastructure. In addition to providing $40 billion for the critical Clean Water State Revolving Fund program, this legislation includes important provisions to provide technical assistance to struggling, small, rural, and tribal communities, invest in the resiliency of our clean water systems, and address the threat of emerging contaminants. I'm also pleased that this legislation includes provisions I had previously offered to promote investments in smart water technology. And I thank my colleagues on both sides of the aisle for working with me to have this language included in the bill. This language will support the innovative work being done by water resources solution companies like Xylem in my district, who are working to deploy cutting-edge technologies nationwide. These technologies play a critical role in meeting critical safety challenges while also decreasing costs for ratepayers and utilities. I am thankful to my colleagues for their work on this proposal, and I hope both sides of the committee can continue to engage on clean water issues and get a bill to the President's desk that will address many challenges we are discussing. Thank you very much. I yield back the balance of my time.
I now recognize Ms. Gonzalez Colon for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I really appreciate that. I want to thank Chairman DeFazio for having including my amendment in the manager package. My amendment states that the funds allotted to Puerto Rico public water utility under the revolving funds grant will not be counted as an income or available assets to be used for the purpose of payment of debt restructuring under the Puerto Rico Oversight Management and Economic Stability Act by the Puerto Rico Financial Oversight and Management Board. This meant to address the concern in some sectors in Puerto Rico and in Washington, D.C. over the past years that the funding Congress provided for public services and recovery could be used for other purposes. When discussing this bill with the Puerto Rico Water Utility, it was brought up that they were not getting immediate access to the full amount of revolving fund grants. Because the Financial Oversight Board regularly puts on a hold on any large disbursement until it can be reviewed whether the intended use conforms to the fiscal plan. Many people worry that this will hold, that this hold will become a redirection of funds provided to island. In the past, it was incorrectly claimed by figures in different parts of the federal government that appropriations for Puerto Rico infrastructure or recovery funds were being reused for the purpose of the payment of the debt. And this was not the case. But by amendment, specifically will clarify in the law that for these water quality funds, it cannot be used so. This is consistent with a reiterated principle ever since PROMESA was first passed, that the Financial Oversight Board will not redirect federal funding appropriated for the needs of the Puerto Rican people. And the debt repayment will be achieved through fiscal measures within the Puerto Rico's budget process. This will not affect the priority of payment of the share for the creditors or other stakeholders, since those will continue to be made based on the actual revenue and savings of the utility in Puerto Rico. The Financial Board will still retain its oversight function in that they still must sign off on any large public contracts as to their compliance with the law and policy, and of course the goals of the fiscal restructuring plan. My amendment will help assure the communities and the utility that funding will not be rebudgeted for use as a debt payment. And I want to thank Chairman for having made this part of the manager amendments package, and express my wish that we could see more examples of such openness of bipartisanship. Thank you, and I yield back.
Thank you. Are there amendments to the amendment? If not, the question is on the amendment. All those in favor signify by saying aye. Aye.
Aye.
Aye.
Those opposed, say no.
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 The ayes have it. The amendment is agreed to. The next amendment is Mr. Graves' amendment, number 1. The clerk will, do I need to? Mr. Graves, do you want to have a, do you have an amendment? I think you have to ask, you have an amendment.
Here it's 001, the permitting.
001.
001.
Oh, Mr. Okay.
I'm recognized.
Okay. Oh, okay. Okay. Thank you. The clerk will designate the amendment.
Amendment to the amendment in the nature of a substitute to HR 1915, offered by Mr. Graves of Louisiana, number PT01.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Yes, sometimes my dad lets me come and help him during markups.
Just go ahead. Without objection, the amendment will be considered as read. I recognize Mr. Garrett, okay, to speak on his, Mr. Graves, to speak on his amendment for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Madam Chair, this amendment is something that many of you may recognize because this amendment came up in the last Congress. This is a bipartisan amendment that worked on with my friend, Mr. Garamendi from California. And what it does is it recognizes the incredible bureaucracy involved with trying to deliver water treatment projects. Right now, under law, a permit for water discharge, federal water pollution discharge permit, has a life of 5 years. 5 years, but as you know, Madam Chair, from anyone who delivers infrastructure projects knows that by the time you go through the bureaucracy, the red tape, that oftentimes that 5 years is not sufficient. And so what this amendment does, and I want to reiterate, this bipartisan amendment does, is it extends the 5-year permit period to 10 years only for public entities for their discharge permit. So pretty easy amendment. Again, this committee's seen this before. I urge adoption of the amendment and will yield back.
Okay, I recognize Chairman DeFazio for 5 minutes.
I thank the chair and I thank the gentleman for his brevity. I'm going to oppose the amendment. Last year we did work out on this a bipartisan compromise on the bill that was reported by voice vote. And that amendment tried to balance the competing voices associated with extending permit terms by also trying to address the backlog of administratively extended permits, sometimes called zombie permits, that today can linger for 10, 15, or even 30 years. A lot of conditions change in 30 years without a review, without expiration, and or reissuance. And many of these entities with these very lengthy extensions are in violation of Clean Water Act requirements. So last year we accommodated that in the amendment review process, but this year that part was stripped. So, when the Clean Water Act was originally established, they determined that, 5 years was a reasonable compromise between regulatory certainty and, the assurance that we were going to make quick progress. Joanna rightly points out that things have become more bureaucratic today, and I think, again, there will be potential for, working on this in the future. There's 16,000 municipal permits for sewage treatment plants, 7,500 for municipal stormwater discharges, permits that could be covered by the scope of this amendment. And two of the leading causes of impairment to water quality today, pathogens, those found in sewage, nutrients found in wastewater and stormwater. And as the gentleman knows, when nutrient contamination increases, so does the size of the annual dead zone that's plagued Louisiana coastal water for decades and other areas of the country. We're experiencing some dead zones off of Oregon now. Extending municipal and state permits for some of the leading causes of water quality impairment today is a potential step backward in meeting the fishable, drinkable, swimmable goals of the Clean Water Act. Second, as I stated earlier, this amendment did not include the compromise we came up with last year. That the states have reported that 39% of permits are extended 1 to 4 years after their statutory expiration, 24% 5 to 9, and 9% 10 to 15, and 3% are more than 15. So the law is clear. It has to be done every 5 years. When states tell us that roughly 1/3 of permits are already more than twice the legal length, this is an issue that needs to be addressed in extending any permit lengths, because this amendment only addresses one side of the complicated issue, and I think would weaken the act. I must stand in opposition to the amendment. I just want to make something clear. One of the previous speakers said this bill isn't going anywhere in the Senate. This bill is going to the Senate, and it's my full intention on this bill and on the service transportation bill to do something that most members of this committee have never experienced, which used to be the way we did things around here, to have a conference committee, an actual conference committee, where we work out differences between the House and Senate version. So yes, this bill is going somewhere. It's going to the Senate. The Senate has a good opening. At one point, Ms. Capito had bid up their numbers on wastewater during those negotiations, which apparently have now terminated. So I think there is some willingness on the part of the Senate, and Senate Republicans even, to go to a higher number and to look at other provisions of the bill. So that's my intention. I pushed the leadership to that. I mean, it was a little bit of they kind of looked shocked when I said, I want to do these bills in regular order. And that's my intention. So with that, I yield back the balance of my time.
Do any other members wish to be recognized to speak on the amendment? The chair recognizes Mr. Graves for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Madam Chair. It wasn't that long ago that Secretary of Transportation Pete Buttigieg, who at the time was mayor of his community back home, testified before our water subcommittee on behalf of this very amendment. We are all aware of the challenges that are facing our communities when it comes to clean water infrastructure. And one thing we can do to help them without spending any more taxpayer dollars is to provide some reasonable regulatory relief. This is common sense legislating. And with that, I would urge adoption of this amendment and yield back the balance.
Do any other members wish to be recognized to speak on the amendment?
Madam Chair.
The chair recognizes Mr. Rouser for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I just want to add that this is a good amendment. This is good common sense reform. And I want to make the point that in a bipartisan effort, this was included in the Republican version of the State Revolving Loan Fund Reauthorization Bill that we introduced. And so I encourage adoption of the amendment and hope that it prevails. I yield back.
Do any other members wish to be recognized to speak on the amendment? Are there amendments to...
on this?
Sorry? Okay. The chair recognizes Mr. Garamendi for 5 minutes.
You want me? Yes, Madam Chair. This amendment really makes a lot of sense. If you're taking a look at how these projects go, It simply doesn't make sense to do it every 5 years. You need a longer period of time. By the time you do the very environmental studies, get the other financing lined up, get all the grants in place, the 5-year period's expired, and then you got to start all over again. So this makes a lot of sense to do it this way. It is, as was said, common sense. So why do we want to go back and redo what we tried to do in the previous 5-year period? And so I do support this. It's a sensible way of going about it, and I appreciate the support of my colleagues, bipartisan at that. I yield back.
Do any other members wish to be recognized to speak on the amendment? Oh, the chair recognizes Mr. Bost.
Thank you. I'd like to yield time to my colleague, Garrett Graves, please.
Madam Chair, I want to thank my friend, Mr. Garamendi from California, for raising this. Look, some things were said about this. I just want to be very clear. I actually thought this was going to happen a lot faster than it has already. Let me just clarify something here. The chairman mentioned the fact that this potentially causes environmental problems. Let me be clear, and I think it's really important that we do quote Secretary Buttigieg and other people that have actually been on the ground trying to comply with these regulations. The environmental conditions don't change when the project's not even built or when things remain the same. Much of this has to do with the bureaucracy that has been created, meaning that it takes approximately forever to deliver projects because of the bureaucracy. And so what ends up happening is you're trying to move forward on a project, your permit has expired, you've got to go back, reapply, which then costs, and let me be clear, this applies just to municipalities, only municipalities. So which means our local taxpayers, our state taxpayers are on the hook for going back through and going through this whole process all over again to ask for the same thing that they just had permission for. And so this isn't something that's going to trash the environment. My friend from California and I, neither one of us would do something that would trash the environment. I think it's more so relative to the conditions that are on the ground when you're actually trying to deliver these infrastructure projects. Now, Mr. Chairman, like I said, I thought this was going to go much faster. Let me offer this, Mr. Chair. I'm disappointed, and I want to say that because this was something that was brought up on a bipartisan basis last Congress. But I would like to ask if you would be willing to just continue to have some discussion with us through the process here. I'd be willing to withdraw this amendment if we can just get a commitment that we can continue discussing. And Mr. Chairman, I want to be clear. I'm not in any way looking for a solution in search of a problem. I do believe there's an issue here, and I think that it affects Republican and Democrat districts across the country. And I just ask if you could give us a commitment. I'd be willing to withdraw the amendment. I yield.
Okay. Well, as I mentioned, last year we did put some conditions on it, particularly regarding some of these, with very, very long extended 20, 30-year permits, so that there would be some certainty regarding those. So we had additional language that is not included in this amendment, and I'd be happy to work with the gentleman as we go toward the floor in the hope that we can get back to where we were last year.
Madam Chair, with that commitment from my friend, I ask unanimous consent to withdraw number 001.
Without objection, the amendment is withdrawn. The next amendment is Mr. Rouser's amendment number 2. The clerk will designate the, to offer your amendment.
Substitute offered by Mr. Rouser for the amendment in the nature of a substitute to H.R. 1915. Offered by Mr. Rouser, numbers ANS 02.
Without objection, the amendment will be considered as read. I recognize Mr. Rouser to speak on his amendment for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Madam Chair. This amendment would essentially substitute the majority's bill with the Senate's bipartisan agreement on wastewater infrastructure reauthorization, which, as mentioned earlier, garnered broad support before being overwhelmingly approved in the Senate this past April. In fact, as I mentioned earlier, the Biden administration issued a statement of administrative policy in support of the Senate's efforts. While the majority's bill authorizes unrealistically high levels that will never get funded, the Senate agreement provides $18 billion for programs within our committee's jurisdiction, which is a major step forward in providing communities with the resources they need for addressing their clean water infrastructure needs. This includes $14.65 billion for the Clean Water State Revolving Fund, as compared to the unrealistic level in the bill we're currently debating. The amendment also funds several grant programs that will assist small, rural, disadvantaged, and tribal communities in addressing their wastewater treatment and other water pollution control issues and infrastructure needs. Now, I think we can all agree on the need to improve our investment in this country's wastewater infrastructure. However, the proposed spending in the majority's bill is simply unsustainable, and we all know that it won't get funded. While the majority's bill shows their desire to go it alone when it comes to infrastructure, this amendment would bring bipartisan solutions to improve our water quality and environment. This amendment only contains, and this is very important, this amendment only contains the parts of the Senate bill that are in this committee's jurisdiction. The Senate bill has further items on drinking water that fall under the jurisdiction of other committees. I support adoption of the amendment, encourage you to support it, and I yield back the remainder of my time.
The chair recognizes Mrs. Napolitano to speak for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I rise in opposition to this amendment, which appears to be the Senate-passed water infrastructure bill. To be clear, I do appreciate all the hard work undertaken by the Senate to move a bill not only out of committee, but across the Senate floor as well. However, there are some significant differences between their bill and our bill under consideration. First, this amendment fails to recognize the current state of play in infrastructure talks. Pardon me. Since the Senate bill passed, the Senate minority has vastly increased their offer for funding levels for water infrastructure. The most recent bid slated $48 billion for water infrastructure. This Rouser amendment would not even put it at half of that. With the state of our infrastructure deteriorating, I do not support decreasing our funding levels for wastewater infrastructure below the stated need. This would also be far below the president's proposed numbers in the American Jobs Plan, as well as Senator Capito's most recent proposal. Additionally, the amendment fails to account for priorities of House members on both sides of the aisle related to addressing this issue of climate change, infrastructure affordability, emerging contaminants, especially PFAS, chemicals, and environmental justice in water infrastructure. For example, the amendment would scrap the codification of Green Project Reserve, which has had bipartisan support for years and will be critical to making our water infrastructure more climate resilient. The amendment would also eliminate technical assistance and specific funding assistance that we included in target small, rural, and tribal communities in critical need of support. Considerations included for workforce development, smart technology programs, accurate surveys of local needs would all be eliminated by adoption of this amendment. Again, I look forward to working with the Senate in conference and in finding common ground between our different bills, but now is not the time to concede to a bill that fails to meet the moment, fails to help the communities most in need, and fails to address the increasing threat of climate change and severe storms to our crumbling water infrastructure. I oppose the substitute amendment and strongly encourage my colleagues to do the same. And I yield back.
Do any other members wish to be recognized to speak on the amendment? Are there any amendments to the amendment? If not, the question is on the amendment. All those in favor signify by saying aye. Those opposed say no. No.
No.
No.
No, no.
The noes have it.
Madam Chair.
The amendment is not agreed to.
Madam Chair.
Yes.
Madam Chair, I call for a roll call vote.
A recorded vote was requested and will be postponed until a later time. The next amendment is Mr. Westerman's amendment, number 1. The clerk will designate the amendment.
Substitute offer of Mr. Westerman for the amendment in the nature of a substitute to H.R. 1915.
Without objection, the amendment will be considered as read. I recognize Mr. Westerman to speak on his amendment for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Madam Chair. It's good to be back here in the committee hearing today. I wish we were back to normal business with all the chairs full and having an in-person debate on such important legislation. As ranking member of the Water Resources and Environment Subcommittee in the last Congress, I can tell you how hard Chairwoman Napolitano, her members and her staff worked with me and my staff and our Republican members to find a compromise bill. After months of negotiations, we figured it out in the last Congress. We passed a bipartisan water quality bill that included the first reauthorization of the Clean Water State Revolving Fund in decades. While we know it wasn't a perfect bill, and both the chairwoman and I had to give a little to find common ground, we were proud and happy to do it. When we marked up that compromise legislation in 2019, Chairwoman Napolitano called it, quote, vital legislation, and asked everyone to support it. Chairman DeFazio said that he strongly supported the bill and praised our bipartisan effort and partnership. Ranking Member Graves followed suit and celebrated how well and how hard we all worked together. Madam Chair, I'm sad that the underlying bill isn't going to get that type of support today, but we can change that if we adopt my amendment. Instead of a partisan bill that leans farther to the left than I believe the House or Senate can support, my amendment proposes the exact text of the bipartisan compromise bill that the chairwoman and I and Chairman DeFazio and Ranking Member Graves agreed to last Congress. In fact, it's the same bill that every member of this committee who was here last year supported, and it passed by a voice vote. Now, if you look at the text in the current bill and the text of last year's bill, you'll find that there are only some subtle changes in much of the authorizations. The big change is 3 times the spending in the current bill as the previous bill. I find it hard to see how in 1 year, when we had a bipartisan agreement, that we can propose 3 times the spending. And while we slip in language like in Section 5 under resiliency, ceding more power to the administration. You know, the only change in that section is saying that this applies to other activities that the administration determines will address identified vulnerabilities. Other activities that the administration determines, that sounds like a lot of leeway giving to the administration determine what those other activities are. Why can't we define what those other activities are instead of pushing 3 times more money out and giving the administration a blank check to spend it? So in the interest of unity and getting something good done for the American people, I urge you to support my amendment, and I yield back.
I recognize Mrs. Napolitano for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I rise in opposition to the amendment offered by my very good friend, Mr. Westerman. First, let me recognize all the hard work that went to drafting bipartisan Clean Water SRF bill from last Congress, in which the gentleman played a large part. However, a lot has happened since this committee reported that bill. And let's make it clear, the funding is really the opposition, nothing else. For example, the COVID pandemic has reminded us of the critical importance of safe, reliable, and affordable water for all our American families. Unfortunately, this substitute amendment does not provide the critical investment needs. It undercuts them. The governors, mayors, and county commissioners are requesting to build our nation's wastewater infrastructure. HR 1915 authorizes $40 billion over the next 5 years for the Clean Water State Revolving Fund and an additional $11.5 billion in grants to states and municipalities to address local water quality challenges for a total investment of over $50 billion over the next 5 years. Yet, the amendment would slash the funding down to a total of just $16 billion over the same period of 5 years. That's not enough. We know that the need is significant to get wastewater treatment facilities in state of good repair, close to 300 billion over 20 years, according to EPA. If we do not meet that demand now, we will never make progress. Stop kicking the can down the road. HR 1915 has support from across the political spectrum, with endorsements from groups ranging from the Associated General Contractors of America to the Clean Water for All Coalition, to the United Steelworkers Union, to the U.S. Conference of Mayors, and the U.S. Chamber of Commerce. All of these groups praise the authorizations level in the bill. Not one has asked us for less money to address our crumbling wastewater infrastructure. If anything, what we have heard overwhelmingly was praise for higher funding levels and a request for more money to go to the door as grants rather than loans. This amendment would harm households and businesses by doing little to address the skyrocketing rates for wastewater services. While a lot of hard work went into last year's bill, we have all learned a great bit more on the importance of water since then. And in my view, the funding levels in this substitute amendment simply do not address the current need on virtually unanimous voices of stakeholders on the level of investment necessary to ensure safe, reliable, and affordable water for all Americans. Unfortunately, I do oppose the amendment and urge my colleagues to do the same. I yield back.
Do any other members wish to be recognized to speak on the amendment? Are there any amendments to the amendment? If not, the question is on the amendment. All those in favor signify by saying aye. Those opposed say no. No.
No.
The noes have it. The amendment is not agreed to.
Madam Chair?
Yes.
Ask for a recorded vote.
A recorded vote was requested and will be postponed until a later time. The next amendment is Mr. Garrett Graves, Staff 1 amendment. The clerk will designate the amendment.
Amendment to the amendment in the nature of a substitute to H.R. 1915, offered by Mr. Graves, Louisiana, number Staff 1.
Without objection, the amendment will be considered as read. I recognize Mr. Graves to speak on his amendment for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Madam Chair, the amendment in nature of substitute includes a provision that has a 15% set aside to help small cities with populations below 10,000. What this amendment does is it increases that set aside from 15% to 20%, and it includes criteria that would then be applied that makes communities eligible that have had multiple disasters in the last 5 years. Madam Chair, obviously the 10,000 population threshold is designed to provide assistance to those communities that otherwise may not have the financial wherewithal to do so. Those communities that have been impacted by multiple disasters are in the same situation. And so I urge adoption of the amendment and efficiently yield back my 4 minutes.
Thank you. The chair recognizes Ms. Napolitano for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I raise an objection to the amendment offered by my very good friend, the gentleman from Louisiana, Mr. Graves. This amendment, while well-intentioned, misses what I believe is the underlying intention of Section 122 of the Clean Water Act. Thanks to the hard work of our committee colleague, Representative Carvajal, 1915 does amend Section 122 to include a new eligibility for federal grants to increase the resiliency of treatment works to man-made and natural disasters, including extreme weather events and drought. However, the underlying grant authority under Section 122 also includes eligibility for purposes including weather discharges, addressing stormwater best management practices, and encouraging communities to develop integrated watershed management plans, and authority for municipalities to enter in an area-wide stormwater management plans. Most of these existing authorities are about smart, Clean Water Act planning and have little to do with the disaster declaration. Mr. Graves' amendment would change the eligibility for the existing small community set-aside funds that the committee felt appropriate to reserve small and rural areas for them that are often overlooked for critical federal grant assistance, to steer more of this money to areas that have had consecutive disaster declarations. While areas that have been prone to natural disasters are deserving of our attention, I do not believe taking money from small and rural communities is a way to accomplish this task because this amendment redirects scarce Clean Water Act grant resources from small and rural communities. I do oppose the amendment, unfortunately, and urge my colleagues to do the same. I yield back.
Do any other members wish to be recognized to speak on the amendment? Are there amendments to the amendment? If not, the question is on the amendment. All those in favor signify by saying aye.
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 Those opposed say no.
No.
The noes have it. The amendment is not agreed to. The next amendment is Mr. Garrett Graves, Staff 2. The clerk will designate the amendment.
Amendment to the amendment in the nature of a substitute to H.R. 1915, offered by Mr. Graves, Louisiana, number 104.
Without objection, the amendment will be considered as read. I recognize Mr. Graves to speak on his amendment for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Madam Chair, this is amendment number Staff 2. What this does is that the base text of the bill has a demonstration program that provides assistance for treating stormwater. Now, let's be clear. The reason stormwater gets into your sewer is because of I&I problems, because of, candidly, a lack of maintenance. And that's why you end up having stormwater that gets into your sewer system. Number one. Number two, this is a, you're talking about just treating stormwater. We have other types of what I'll refer to as contamination of our freshwater system, and that's saltwater. And I want to be clear, Madam Chair, that's not because of any lack of maintenance issue at home. It's because of the federal government's actions. As we've discussed in this committee many, many times, the United States Army Corps of Engineers put levees on the river, stopped the accretion of growth of land in the state of Louisiana. We began retreating. Now we have some of the highest levels of subsidence in the world. We have the highest level of coastal wetlands loss. In fact, 90% of the coastal wetlands loss in the continental United States occurs in our state, which causes salinity levels to increase and to move northward, which contaminates our freshwater system. So this amendment simply says that treating salinity levels is a eligible use of funds under this demonstration program. Now, Madam Chair, a couple of things. And number one, the description provided by this committee to members says, quote, likely an attempt to use EPA funds for Corps of Engineers sediment diversion project. First of all, Madam Chair, I've had a chance to work in this body for a little while, and I've never, ever seen a scenario where someone tries to interpret the intent of an amendment. The amendment does just what I said it does. Number two, if somebody in here sitting in this room believes that this is an attempt to get money for a Corps of Engineers project, Madam Chair, I'd be happy right now to ask unanimous consent to include a provision that says that this program can't supplant funds that are coming from a Corps of Engineer project. I have no idea why anybody would try to take this, try to exercise that kind of editorial discretion and try and interpret what our intent or our amendment is. That's what the amendment does. If anybody, and I want to offer again, if anybody on the other side or anybody in this committee has a problem or thinks that's the intent, then I will happily offer a UC that says that it can't supplant those funds. Anyone? All right. Now, the other thing I want to bring up, now that I heard some of the feedback on the last amendment. You know, Madam Chair, this amendment in the nature of a substitute, you know, it's fascinating. I heard that the last, my friend from California just said that on my last amendment that we're taking money away from those small and disadvantaged communities. If you read our amendment, it explicitly says, and this is the previous amendment, it explicitly says that is a second priority. It says in this order of priority. That's what the amendment says. Number two, something that many of you probably don't know that this ANS includes, is it includes a provision that says that if you're in the District of Columbia, you get 100% federal cost of your project covered. Now, let's take a look at the comparison there. If we're all of a sudden concerned about disadvantaged communities, apparently. You know what the median income in Washington, D.C. is? It's $86,000 a year. $86,000. You know what the median income is in the state that I represent and Congressman Carter represents? It's less than $50,000. The percentage of the impoverished community in Washington, D.C. is 13.5%. In our state, it's 19%. Who's disadvantaged and who's getting assistance from the federal government and who's not? This is black is white, left is right, right is wrong, everything. I mean, this is the most absurd bill and process where we're not even stepping in and trying to actually help the people that need help and putting the dollars where they deserve to be placed. So with that, Madam Chair, I urge adoption of this amendment and yield back.
The chair recognizes Ms. Napolitano to speak for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I like the presentation Mr. Graves has said, but I still raise an objection to the amendment offered by my good friend, the gentleman from Louisiana, Mr. Graves. We feel that this amendment seeks to expand the eligibility of an existing alternative water source program for purposes wholly unrelated to the reason this program was created. The alternative water source program was enacted in 2000 to help communities that were facing and continue to face threats that their local water supplies are drying up or simply becoming less reliable to address local needs. This is especially true in the arid regions of our country, especially in the Southwest and West Coast, areas that are now maybe facing a super drought, they are facing a super drought for the foreseeable future, as well as southeastern regions of the country. This amendment, however, seems to try and steer these critical water supply funds to address an ongoing effort by the gentleman state to pay for freshwater diversion projects that are far removed from the intended purposes of the program to promote water recycling. Water recycling is critical in our area. The committee is aware of the ongoing efforts by the state of Louisiana to partner with the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers for sediment and freshwater diversion projects. However, the appropriate source of federal funding for similar projects is the Corps, not from EPA programs aimed at ensuring the availability of drinking water sources for those regions of the country struggling to ensure a safe, reliable, and affordable source of water for their communities. For these reasons, I oppose this amendment and urge my colleagues to do the same. I yield back.
Do any other members wish to be recognized to speak on this amendment? Are there amendments to the amendment? If not, the question is on the amendment. All those in favor signify by saying aye.
Aye.
Aye. Aye.
Those opposed?
No.
Those opposed say no.
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 The noes have it. The amendment is not agreed to. We will now proceed to consideration of the amendments on which the recorded votes were requested and postponed. Members are reminded to have their cameras on and to clearly state your name when called upon by the clerk to record your vote. The question is on agreeing to the amendment offered by Mr. Rouser, number 2, on which the noes prevailed. Is a recorded vote still requested?
Yes.
The clerk will call the roll.
Mr. DeFazio. Mr. Graves of Missouri. Aye. Mr. Graves of Missouri votes aye. Ms. Norton.
Ms. Norton votes no.
Ms. Norton votes no. Mr. Young. Ms. Johnson of Texas.
Johnson of Texas votes no.
Ms. Johnson of Texas votes no. Mr. Crawford.
Pretty high up in here, so.
Mr. Crawford votes aye.
Yes.
Mr. Larson of Washington.
Larson votes no.
Mr. Larson of Washington votes no. Mr. Gibbs.
Gibbs votes aye.
Mr. Gibbs votes aye. Ms. Napolitano.
Napolitano, no.
Ms. Napolitano votes no. Mr. Webster.
Webster votes yes.
Mr. Webster votes aye. Mr. Cohen.
Mr. Cohen votes no.
Mr. Cohen votes no. Mr. Massey. Mr. Sires.
Massey votes aye.
Mr. Massey votes aye. Mr. Sires.
Mr. Series votes no.
Mr. Sires votes no. Mr. Perry. Mr. Garamendi.
Mr. Perry votes aye.
Mr. Perry votes aye. Mr. Garamendi.
Garamendi votes no.
Mr. Garamendi votes no. Mr. Rodney Davis of Illinois. Mr. Rodney Davis of Illinois votes aye. Mr. Johnson of Georgia.
No.
Mr. Johnson of Georgia votes no. Mr. Katko.
All of these. Yeah, see what Kako does. He should be in.
Mr. Carson.
Mr. Carson votes no.
Mr. Carson votes no. Mr. Babin. Mr. Babin votes aye. Ms. Titus. Mr. Graves of Louisiana. Mr. Graves of Louisiana votes aye. Mr. Maloney of New York. Mr. Rouser.
Aye.
Mr. Rouser votes aye. Mr. Huffman.
Huffman, no.
Mr. Huffman votes no. Mr. Bost. Mr. Bost votes aye. Ms. Brownlee.
Ms. Brownlee votes no.
Ms. Brownlee votes no. Mr. Weber of Texas. Ms. Wilson of Florida.
Ms. Wilson votes no.
Ms. Wilson of Florida votes no. Mr. LaMalfa.
Aye.
Mr. LaMalfa votes aye. Mr. Payne. Mr. Westerman.
Aye.
Mr. Westerman votes aye. Mr. Lowenthal.
Mr. Lowenthal votes no.
Mr. Lowenthal votes no. Mr. Mast.
Mr. Mast votes aye.
Mr. Mast votes aye. Mr. DeSaulnier.
DeSaulnier votes no.
Mr. DeSaulnier votes no. Mr. Gallagher. Mr. Lynch. Mr. Fitzpatrick.
Next time you gotta just reschedule.
Fitzpatrick votes no.
Mr. Fitzpatrick votes no. Mr. Carbajal.
Carbajal votes no.
Mr. Carbajal votes no. Ms. Gonzalez Colon. Mr. Brown.
Mr. Brown votes no.
Mr. Brown votes no. Mr. Balderson. Mr. Malinowski.
Malinowski, no.
Mr. Malinowski votes no. Mr. Stauber.
Stauber votes aye.
Mr. Stauber votes aye. Mr. Stanton.
Stanton votes no.
Mr. Stanton votes no. Mr. Burchett.
Aye.
Mr. Burchett votes aye. Mr. Allred.
Allred votes no.
Mr. Allred votes no. Mr. Johnson of South Dakota.
Vote aye.
Mr. Johnson of South Dakota votes aye. Ms. Davids of Kansas.
No.
Ms. Davids of Kansas votes no. Mr. Van Drew.
Mr. Van Drew votes no.
Mr. Van Drew votes no. Mr. Garcia of Illinois.
Garcia votes no.
Mr. Garcia of Illinois votes no. Mr. Guest.
Guest votes aye.
Mr. Guest votes aye. Mr. Delgado.
Delgado votes no.
Mr. Delgado votes no. Mr. Nails.
Nails votes aye.
Mr. Nails votes aye. Mr. Pappas.
Pappas votes no.
Mr. Pappas votes no. Ms. Mace.
Aye.
Ms. Mace votes aye. Mr. Lamb.
Mr. Lamb votes no.
Mr. Lamb votes no. Ms. Maliotakis.
Maliotakis votes aye.
Ms. Maliotakis votes aye. Mr. Moulton.
Moulton, no.
Gonzalez Colon votes aye.
Ms. Gonzalez Colon votes aye. Mr. Moulton.
Moulton, no.
Mr. Moulton votes no. Ms. Van Dyne.
Van Dyne votes aye.
Ms. Van Dyne votes aye. Mr. Auchincloss.
Auchincloss votes no.
Mr. Auchincloss votes no. Mr. Jimenez.
Mr. Jimenez votes aye.
Mr. Jimenez votes aye. Ms. Bardot. Ms. Bardot votes no. Mrs. Steele. Ms. Kahale.
Kahele, no.
Ms. Kahale votes no. Ms. Strickland.
Ms. Strickland votes no.
Ms. Strickland votes no. Ms. Williams of Georgia.
Williams of Georgia votes no.
Ms. Williams of Georgia votes no. Ms. Newman.
Newman votes no.
Ms. Newman votes no. Mr. Carter.
Mr. Carter votes no.
Mr. Carter votes no. Mr. DeFazio. Mr. DeFazio votes no. Mr. Young. Mr. Katko.
Mr. Katko votes no.
Mr. Katko votes no. Ms. Titus.
Titus votes no.
Ms. Titus votes no. Mr. Maloney of New York.
No.
Mr. Maloney of New York votes no. Mr. Weber of Texas.
Mr. Weber votes aye.
Mr. Weber of Texas votes aye. Mr. Payne.
Mr. Payne votes no.
Mr. Payne votes no. Mr. Gallagher. Mr. Lynch. Mr. Balderson. Mr. Balderson votes aye. Mrs. Steele.
Do any other members wish to be recorded?
How is Massey recorded?
Mr. Massey is recorded as aye.
That's correct.
How's Matt recorded?
Mast. Yes. Mast.
Mr. Mast is recorded as aye.
Do any other?
Malfoy recorded?
Mr. LaMalfa is recorded as aye.
Thank you.
How is Ms. Wilson recorded?
Ms. Wilson of Florida is recorded as no.
Thank
All right, the clerk will report the vote.
Madam Chair, on this vote, there were 26 yeas and 39 noes.
The amendment is not agreed to. The question is on agreeing to the amendment offered by Mr. Westerman, number 1, on which the noes prevailed. Is a recorded vote still requested?
It is.
The clerk will call the roll.
Mr. DeFazio. No. Mr. DeFazio votes no. Mr. Graves of Missouri. Mr. Graves of Missouri votes aye. Ms. Norton.
Congresswoman Norton votes no.
Ms. Norton votes no. Mr. Young. Ms. Johnson of Texas.
Johnson of Texas votes no.
Ms. Johnson of Texas votes no. Mr. Crawford.
Crawford, aye.
Mr. Crawford votes aye. Mr. Larson of Washington.
Larson votes no.
Mr. Larson of Washington votes no. Mr. Gibbs.
Gibbs votes aye.
Mr. Gibbs votes aye. Ms. Napolitano.
No.
Mrs. Napolitano votes no. Mr. Webster.
Webster votes yay.
Mr. Webster votes aye. Mr. Cohen.
Mr. Cohen votes no.
Mr. Cohen votes no. Mr. Massey.
Massey votes aye.
Mr. Massey votes aye. Mr. Sirez. Mr. Perry.
Mr. Perry votes aye.
Mr. Perry votes aye. Mr. Garamendi.
Garamendi votes no.
Mr. Garamendi votes no. Mr. Rodney Davis of Illinois. Mr. Rodney Davis of Illinois votes aye. Mr. Johnson of Georgia.
Johnson, no.
Mr. Johnson of Georgia votes no. Mr. Katko.
Mr. Katko votes no.
Mr. Katko votes no. Mr. Carson.
Mr. Carson votes no.
Mr. Carson votes no. Mr. Babin. Mr. Babin votes aye. Ms. Titus.
Titus votes no.
Ms. Titus votes no. Mr. Graves, Louisiana. Mr. Graves, Louisiana votes aye. Mr. Maloney of New York.
Maloney votes no.
Mr. Maloney of New York votes no. Mr. Rouser.
Aye.
Mr. Rouser votes aye. Mr. Huffman.
No.
Mr. Huffman votes no. Mr. Bost. Mr. Bost votes aye. Ms. Brownlee.
Brownlee votes no.
Ms. Brownlee votes no. Mr. Weber of Texas.
Weber votes aye.
Mr. Weber of Texas votes aye. Ms. Wilson of Florida.
Ms. Wilson of Florida votes no.
Ms. Wilson of Florida votes no. Mr. LaMalfa.
Aye.
Mr. LaMalfa votes aye. Mr. Payne.
Mr. Payne votes no.
Mr. Payne votes no. Mr. Westerman.
Aye.
Mr. Westerman votes aye. Mr. Lowenthal.
Lowenthal votes no.
Mr. Lowenthal votes no. Mr. Mast.
Mr. Mast votes aye.
Mr. Mast votes aye. Mr. DeSaulnier.
DeSaulnier votes no.
Mr. DeSaulnier votes no. Mr. Gallagher. Mr. Lynch. Mr. Fitzpatrick.
Fitzpatrick votes no.
Mr. Fitzpatrick votes no. Mr. Carbajal.
Carvajal votes no.
Mr. Carbajal votes no. Ms. Gonzalez Colon. Mr. Brown.
Mr. Brown votes no.
Mr. Brown votes no. Mr. Balderson. Mr. Balderson votes aye. Mr. Malinowski.
No. Malinowski, no.
Mr. Malinowski votes no. Mr. Stauber.
Mr. Stauber votes aye.
Mr. Stauber votes aye. Mr. Stanton.
Stanton votes no.
Mr. Stanton votes no. Mr. Burchett.
Aye.
Mr. Burchett votes aye. Mr. Allred.
Allred votes no.
Mr. Allred votes no. Mr. Johnson, South Dakota.
Aye.
Mr. Johnson, South Dakota votes aye. Ms. Davids of Kansas.
No.
Ms. Davids of Kansas votes no. Mr. Van Drew.
Mr. Van Drew votes no.
Mr. Van Drew votes no. Mr. Garcia of Illinois.
Garcia votes no.
Mr. Garcia of Illinois votes no. Mr. Guest.
Aye.
Mr. Guest votes aye. Mr. Delgado.
Delgado votes no.
Mr. Delgado votes no. Mr. Nails.
Nails votes aye.
Mr. Nails votes aye. Mr. Pappas.
No.
Mr. Pappas votes aye. Votes no. Ms. Mace.
Aye.
Ms. Mace votes aye. Mr. Lamb.
Mr. Lamb votes no.
Mr. Lamb votes no. Ms. Maliotakis.
Yes.
Ms. Maliotakis votes aye. Mr. Moulton.
Moulton, no.
Could the gentleman
Gonzalez Colon
repeat?
votes aye.
Could Mr. Moulton repeat?
Moulton, no.
Mr. Moulton votes no. Ms. Van Dyne.
Aye.
Ms. Van Dyne votes aye. Mr. Auchincloss.
Gonzalez,
Auchincloss, no.
Mr. Auchincloss votes no. Mr. Jimenez.
Mr. Jimenez votes aye.
Mr. Jimenez votes aye. Ms. Bardot.
No.
Ms. Bardot votes no. Mrs. Steele.
Steele votes aye.
Mrs. Steele votes aye. Mr. Kahale.
Kahele, no.
Mr. Kahale votes no. Ms. Strickland.
Ms. Strickland votes no.
Ms. Strickland votes no. Ms. Williams of Georgia.
Williams of Georgia votes no.
Ms. Williams of Georgia votes no. Ms. Newman.
Newman votes no.
Ms. Newman votes no. Mr. Carter.
Carter votes no.
Mr. Carter votes no. Mr. Young. Mr. Cirez.
Mr. Series votes no.
Mr. Cirez votes no. Mr. Gallagher. Mr. Lynch. Ms. Gonzalez Colon.
Gonzalez Colon votes aye.
Ms. Gonzalez Colon votes aye.
Do any other members wish to be recorded? The clerk will report the vote.
Madam Chair, on this vote, there were 27 yeas and 39 noes.
The amendment is not agreed to. The question is on the amendment in the nature of a substitute as amended. Those in favor say aye.
Aye.
I'm sorry. Whoops. You already did. You already did. Yeah, so we're good. This is aye. Yeah, those opposed, no.
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 In the opinion of in the opinion of the chair, the ayes have it, and the amendment in the nature of a substitute as amended is agreed to. The question is now on the adoption and favorable reporting of H.R. 1915 as amended to the House of Representatives. All those in favor say aye.
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 All those opposed, no.
No.
The ayes have it.
Madam Chair,
The bill is,
Madam
Yes.
Chair, I ask for a recorded vote.
a recorded vote was requested, and the clerk will call the roll.
Mr. DeFazio. Aye. Mr. DeFazio votes aye. Mr. Graves of Missouri. Mr. Graves of Missouri votes no. Ms. Norton.
Congresswoman Norton votes no.
Ms. Norton votes no. Mr. Young.
Votes no, I'm sorry.
Aye.
I'm sorry, votes aye.
Ms. Norton votes aye.
Votes aye.
Mr. Young. Ms. Johnson of Texas.
Johnson of Texas votes aye.
Ms. Johnson of Texas votes aye. Mr. Crawford.
Crawford, no.
Mr. Crawford votes no. Mr. Larson of Washington.
Larson votes yes.
Mr. Larson of Washington votes aye. Mr. Gibbs.
Gibbs, no.
Mr. Gibbs votes no. Ms. Napolitano.
Napolitano, aye.
Mrs. Napolitano votes aye. Mr. Webster.
Webster votes nay.
Mr. Webster votes no. Mr. Cohen. Mr. Massey.
Massey votes nay.
Mr. Massey votes no. Mr. Cirez.
Series votes yes.
Mr. Cirez votes aye. Mr. Perry.
Mr. Perry votes no.
Mr. Perry votes no. Mr. Garamendi.
Garamendi votes aye.
Mr. Garamendi votes aye. Mr. Rodney Davis of Illinois. Mr. Rodney Davis of Illinois votes no. Mr. Johnson of Georgia.
Johnson of Georgia votes aye.
Mr. Johnson of Georgia votes aye. Mr. Katko.
Mr. Kako votes aye.
Mr. Katko votes aye. Mr. Carson.
Mr. Carson votes aye.
Mr. Carson votes aye. Mr. Babin. Mr. Babin votes no. Ms. Titus.
Titus votes aye.
Ms. Titus votes aye. Mr. Graves, Louisiana. Mr. Graves, Louisiana votes no. Mr. Maloney of New York.
Aye.
Mr. Maloney of New York votes aye. Mr. Rouser.
No.
Mr. Rouser votes no. Mr. Huffman.
Aye.
Mr. Huffman votes aye. Mr. Bost. Mr. Bost votes no. Ms. Brownlee.
Brownlee votes aye.
Ms. Brownlee votes aye. Mr. Weber of Texas.
Weber votes no.
Mr. Weber of Texas votes no. Ms. Wilson of Florida.
Ms. Wilson votes aye.
Ms. Wilson of Florida votes aye. Mr. LaMalfa.
LaMalfa, no.
Mr. LaMalfa votes no. Mr. Payne.
Payne votes aye.
0, 2, 7, 6, 8, 0, 0, 2.
Someone needs to mute themselves.
Mr. Payne.
Mr. Payne votes aye.
Mr. Payne votes aye. Mr. Westerman.
No.
Mr. Westerman votes no. Mr. Lowenthal.
Lowenthal votes aye.
Mr. Lowenthal votes aye. Mr. Mast.
Mr. Mast votes no.
Mr. Mast votes no. Mr. DeSaulnier.
DeSaulnier, aye.
Mr. DeSaulnier votes aye. Mr. Gallagher. Mr. Lynch. Mr. Lynch votes aye. Mr. Fitzpatrick.
Fitzpatrick votes aye.
Mr. Fitzpatrick votes aye. Mr. Carbajal.
Carbajal votes aye.
Mr. Carbajal votes aye. Ms. Gonzalez Colon.
Gonzalez Colon votes aye.
Ms. Gonzalez Colon votes aye. Mr. Brown.
Mr. Brown votes aye.
Mr. Brown votes aye. Mr. Balderson. Mr. Balderson votes no. Mr. Malinowski.
Malinowski, aye.
Mr. Malinowski votes aye. Mr. Stauber.
Stauber votes no.
Mr. Stauber votes no. Mr. Stanton.
Stanton votes yes.
Mr. Stanton votes aye. Mr. Burchett.
Burchett votes no.
Mr. Burchett votes no. Mr. Allred.
Allred votes aye.
Mr. Allred votes aye. Mr. Johnson of South Dakota.
No.
Mr. Johnson of South Dakota votes no. Ms. Davids of Kansas.
Aye.
Ms. Davids of Kansas votes aye. Mr. Van Drew. The gentleman appears to be
Mr.
muted.
Vandrew votes yes.
Mr. Van Drew votes aye. Mr. Garcia of Illinois.
Garcia is no.
Mr. Garcia of Illinois votes no. Mr.
I'm
Guest.
sorry, that's an aye. I'm sorry. Garcia is aye.
Mr. Garcia votes aye. Mr. Guest.
No.
Mr. Guest votes no. Mr. Delgado.
Delgado votes aye.
Mr. Delgado votes aye. Mr. Nails.
Nels votes no.
Mr. Nails votes no. Mr. Pappas.
Pappas votes aye.
Mr. Pappas votes aye. Ms. Mace. Mr. Lamb.
No.
Ms. Mace votes no. Mr. Lamb.
Lamb votes yes.
Mr. Lamb votes aye. Ms. Maliotakis.
Aye.
Ms. Maliotakis votes aye. Mr. Moulton.
Moulton, aye.
Mr. Moulton votes aye. Ms. Van Dyne.
No.
Ms. Van Dyne votes no. Mr. Auchincloss.
Auchincloss votes aye.
Mr. Auchincloss votes aye. Mr. Jimenez.
Mr. Jimenez votes no.
Mr. Jimenez votes no. Ms. Bardot.
Aye.
Ms. Bardot votes aye. Mrs. Steele.
Steele votes no.
Mrs. Steele votes no. Mr. Kahele.
Kahele, aye.
Mr. Kahele votes aye. Ms. Strickland.
Ms. Strickland votes aye.
Ms. Strickland votes aye. Ms. Williams of Georgia.
Williams of Georgia votes aye.
Ms. Williams of Georgia votes aye. Ms. Newman.
Newman votes yes.
Ms. Newman votes aye. Mr. Carter.
Carter, yes.
Mr. Carter votes aye. Mr. Young.
Mr. Cohen, vote. Can Mr. Cohen be recorded as an aye?
Mr. Cohen is not recorded.
I'd like to be aye.
Mr. Cohen votes aye. Mr. Young. Mr. Gallagher.
Do any other members wish to be recorded?
No, it's going to come up in. Okay, I'm going to put my.
Speaker for district, I had some questions for you on that.
Please mute. Please mute.
I'm sorry. You said redistrict.
All members have cast their votes. The clerk will report the vote.
Mr. Chairman, on that vote, there were 42 ayes and 25 noes.
The bill is agreed to. The committee shall stand in recess for 5 minutes.